Welcome to our Parkside Chat. I'm Dean Nancy Guerra from the School of Social Ecology, and we're very pleased today to be here with Professor Charis Kubrin, who is in the Department of Criminology, Law and Society and an expert in crime trends and crime policy. The idea behind our Parkside Chats is to bring faculty expertise to bear on some of the challenges that we face in responding to COVID-19, and both in terms of being able to learn from it as well as maybe some strategies and a path forward that we might be able to take. So one question that you might think about, it's sort of obvious, is, well, what happens with crime when everybody is essentially quarantined at home? Does it go down? Does it go up? It's really not clear. So we thought to have an expert here would be a great opportunity to learn more about that. So why don't we start by talking a little bit, maybe Dr. Kubrin, you could tell us a little bit about what's happened since we're on lockdown in California, in the US, in the world. Are there variations of interest?
Yeah, so I mean, when you think about what's happening during the pandemic in terms of social distancing, stay-at-home orders, less travel, bars, restaurants closed, all of these things, it doesn't take a lot to figure out that this is going to impact crime in significant ways, and it turns out that the data show, in fact, that crimes have plummeted.
Wow.
Yeah, if you look in the United States, if you look in cities worldwide, there's a general trend that crime has essentially gone down pretty much following the stay-at-home orders. Depending on when they were implemented, we see drastic drops in crime, not surprisingly.
And why are the experts, that's just opportunities don't exist, or what's kind of the thinking behind why?
Right, so, well, first of all, I should preface this by saying that the crimes that we're talking about here are the typical UCR Part 1 crimes, so we're talking about murder, rape, robbery, assault, burglary, larceny, and auto theft, with some exceptions on auto theft, which I'll mention in a minute, but basically these crimes are dropping largely because many of them are crimes of opportunity, especially property crime. As you close up shops, as you close restaurants, commercial establishments, the ability to burglarize them goes right down. And because people are not congregating in large crowds where alcohol is served, for example, we see fewer assaults, we see fewer robberies as people are not out and about doing things out in society. So a lot of it can be explained by simply less opportunity. There are some, however, crimes where opportunities persist, and we see slight upticks of those crimes. Auto theft is one example. So cities across the United States have witnessed upticks in auto theft. And also we see burglaries of commercial establishments going up. So for example, residential burglaries of homes where people now are spending most of their time, we've seen that gone down. But opportunities then for commercial burglary, business establishments have gone up. So mostly crime is down, but it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of a few of the crimes where opportunities increase.
Wow, that's really interesting. Now, what about other kinds of crime? So you might think that when there's less opportunity, there'd be less crime, but things like hate crimes, for example, I know that there's always a scapegoat for every pandemic or problem, and what have we seen in terms of groups that are scapegoated, or have hate crimes increased just as people try to understand the cause of it, and they have a hard time understanding that it just happens, viruses spread, so they want to blame someone. So how have hate crimes changed?
Right, well, so the typical street crimes have gone down, but some have gone up, and hate crime is one of them. And this is nothing new. I think if you look at the history of pandemics, we find that pandemics always provide opportunities to scapegoat groups. In this case, it's Asian Americans who have been scapegoated. There's a lot of hate crime happening. We see rises in reports of hate crimes directed at Asian Americans. And a lot of the arguments are that Asians have created the virus, they're the cause of the virus, they're the problem behind the virus. So we see upticks in hate crime, not just for Asians, but in general, I think. I've seen hate crimes towards Jewish people have gone up as well.
And is that true globally, or have we just seen it really in the US?
So I've been mostly focused on what's happening in the United States, but I think these trends are global. If we talk about the regular street crimes that I mentioned earlier, those are in fact global trends. Cities across the United States have seen these plummets. Although some places less so than others. There's plenty of variability across place, but overall the plummet's been down for many locales throughout the world, but I think for hate crime that's uniformly up.
Now, do we have any research or data on whether or not the media presentation influences hate crime? When the media say it's China and it comes from China and you hear it over and over again and this blaming, do we know whether that has a direct relation with hate crime? Has anyone been studying that?
I think prior research tells us that that is definitely the case. So we're now starting to see research come in looking at these kinds of questions with respect to COVID. But that's still new, and the research is just happening right now. I guarantee you my colleagues across the country, around the world, are looking at this very kind of question. But we know from prior examples of pandemics and other sorts of major shifts in society that generally happens, that there's a direct correlation between media consumption and crime more generally.
And you would really hope that the media would be a little more careful in the way they report this so that they don't have an unintended effect when it's just based on speculation, conjecture, not based on actual data.
Yeah, the tricky thing with media is that its relationship to people's perceptions on crime is quite complex. So in some cases, there's theories that suggest that the media reinforce pre-existing conceptions that people have about groups or crimes, for example. But there's other theories that propose that, in fact, a media consumption is the single driver, especially among people who have very little interaction with other groups of people or with experiences with crime. So, for example, we know among older Americans, many of them are very fearful of crime, even as their own victimization experiences have been small, but that's primarily because they watch a lot of local TV news, which tends to highlight crime.
Well, and probably exacerbated by the fact that people are home now, so I don't know about everyone else, but I'm certainly watching more TV.
Absolutely, and I think a good analysis of the media consumption and people's perceptions would have to not just take into account the amount of news that they're consuming, but their pre-existing beliefs, which news source, how that's shifting over time, because I think media narratives are obviously shifting, in some cases, day by day as this pandemic goes along.
That's fascinating. Let me switch a little bit into another topic that I think people would be interested in, and that's really more along relationship violence lines, because you've shown us that as opportunities go down, crime goes down, the typical burglary, robbery crimes go down. In some way, when you're stuck at home with your children and your spouse or your partner, your family, the opportunity for crime could go up because you're with them 24/7. It might be exacerbated by alcohol, exacerbated by unemployment. All of the factors that we know increase crime could also be present in this kind of a situation within families. So have we seen increases in domestic violence, child abuse? That would be definitely a concern.
Oh, absolutely. I think calls to domestic violence hotlines have gone up. Instances of domestic violence have gone up. Reports of domestic violence have gone up. A colleague of mine, Alex Picaro at UT Dallas, recently, yesterday in fact, published a study systematically analyzing the impact of sort of COVID on domestic violence calls. And he found a very quick spike initially following stay-at-home orders, at least in Dallas. And so anecdotally, we see this happening. We're now seeing studies that are showing that this is happening. So absolutely. It's not that crime has entirely been displaced at home, but certainly for this kind of crime, and it makes a lot of sense. People are stressed out, there's economic considerations, people are in close quarters together all day long, alcohol, in some cases, mental health, depression issues, you're going to see a spike in domestic violence, unfortunately, and that's what's happening. Now, the extent to which this will continue on is an open question, but for sure, this is a concern among researchers.
I think something interesting that we're learning from this, and speaking from a social ecological perspective where we try to understand people in context, is that we're quick to blame people for crime. You're a bad person, you're antisocial, you have certain personality characteristics, But a pandemic like this that so dramatically shifts our context in a way shows us that context matters.
Oh, absolutely.
That a lot of behavior is really a function of the specific contingencies in the context. And so if you reduce opportunity or you increase opportunity, you're really going to see a shift in crime. So maybe a silver lining is that it takes us away from just looking for bad people who do bad things and understanding that people live in contexts that can be bad or good or promotive of crime or really preventive of crime. And it feels like in this country a lot of our model is on individual blame. You know, you're a bad person, you go to prison, rather than trying to really understand the context. And so perhaps this will show us that we need to focus more on context.
Oh, it's always person in context. As criminologists, we definitely pay attention to context. It raises a methodological question because, for example, street drug sales are down. That's not a surprise. People are not out on the streets. So drug arrests are down. The question is, however, has that behavior shifted online? So in trying to address the person in context question, you have to deal with issues of displacement and how things are shifting and changing. And so it's difficult to actually get at the core, is crime going down or is it being displaced? Are opportunities shifting to different locations? Still, at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. You can't study individual behavior outside of a context. That context could be the home, it could be the neighborhood, it could be jails and prisons.
Well, and that brings up a really important question on the whole area of cybercrime and scams. I know in our last Parkside chat with Susan Charles, she was talking about the increased amount of basically scams of the elderly who are a vulnerable population. They're home alone. Someone nice calls and talks to them and asks them for their credit card or their PIN number or things like that. And is it too soon to really know if that's on the increase and particularly targeting vulnerable populations?
Yeah, I think anecdotally it is on the increase. We don't have, again, we're just now conducting the studies. And it's much easier to do these studies with the sort of Uniform Crime Report Part 1 data that I mentioned that police departments are releasing on their web pages. So my colleague George Tita here in Criminology, Law and Society did a study looking at the impact of COVID closures on crime, both in Los Angeles and Indianapolis, focusing mainly on the burglary, the property and violent crimes that we typically know. He found high spikes for domestic violence, I should say, in both contexts. But in terms of the financial fraud, the white-collar crime, corporate crime, that sort of thing, exactly.
This is the IRS, you have to give me your credit card or you're going to be sent to jail.
Those data come from different places and different locations, and you have micro examples of this sort of thing, like individuals price gouging on Amazon, for example. We've seen price gouging go up. But then you have the more macro sorts of crimes that are of interest, such as senators selling stocks right after the one of the press conferences. So the data on that is a little bit more difficult to access, and so it's more difficult to publish studies looking at COVID and its impact on white-collar structural crimes. Sally Simpson, who's at the University of Maryland, has done great work looking at this sort of thing in previous times, like she looked at the impact of the 2008-2009 Great Recession, for example, on white-collar crimes. And this will be a similar situation because right now the economic downturn is I guess, let me put it this way, the 2008-2009 recession provides us with some insight to how the economic conditions of COVID-19 may impact crimes of opportunity, whether they're street crimes, burglary, robbery, or white-collar fraud types of crimes.
Well, there's always this kind of personal interest at the white-collar level. I can make more money, I can sell my stocks and not lose money. And I had hoped, being a psychologist, that the shared reality of something like COVID-19 would make us much more sensitive to our common humanity, to we're all part of the same team, that we have to work together, better together, and that you could then maybe have a reduction in crimes of just pleasure for yourself, or you want to get more, or certainly people who sold their stocks before the market tanked could have afforded to not do that.
Right.
You know, it's not you
I
need
mean,
to eat or
yeah.
basic needs. But I don't know how we would even measure that. You know, do people feel...
It's important to remember these, I think, are isolated incidents. I mean,
Right.
not to say that this kind of crime isn't, I want to emphasize that this crime does occur. We have lots of problem with white-collar crime, corporate crime. I don't want to downplay that. But these cases that make the news, with the senators, for example, you know, I guess my point is we need to look at what the data say on the whole. And right now it's too soon to say much about that. There is no doubt that people are taking advantage of opportunities. A lot of the crime that was happening on the street is moving online. But also people are complying. I mean, most people follow the directives of their stay-at-home directives. Most people are behaving themselves. Most people are conforming to the rules, not engaging in crime. Overall, crime is down. That's all good. So, but there are concerns that we have. The movement of some of this online, domestic violence, as we mentioned before, hate crimes. More and more people are purchasing guns. So the question is, what impact might that have in the shorter term and longer term on crime rates, especially as we start to come out of lockdown?
And why do you think that is? Like, what's your speculation, or is there any data that why people decide to buy it? You're home and everybody else is home. I don't think they're gonna, you know, you don't really need a gun. Why do people want guns?
Right. This is one of the most shocking statistics that's been happening is the amount of people that during the months of March and April have went out and purchased firearms. And I saw a statistic that if you compare March of this year to March of the previous year, well over 2 times the number of guns purchased in that month alone. So clearly people are purchasing guns in large numbers.
Do they feel threatened somehow that there's a threat out there, even though you can't shoot at the virus?
I don't know the reasons why. My guess
kill
is
you,
that
virus.
Fear and uncertainty push people to purchase firearms in large numbers. One question for understanding this would be to look at whether it's people that already own firearms that are purchasing more firearms, or whether you have new people that have never purchased firearms going to purchase a firearm.
What's your guess?
Well, I think it's people that already have firearms purchasing more firearms. And so, you know, there's the literature on gun ownership, gun availability, and crime. We could spend a whole day talking about what that looks like. But this will certainly be something that researchers who study gun violence will want to be following closely, again, as we move out of lockdown.
So let me ask you this. You've really given us a lot of information. If I had $10 million that I was going to give you to do a study on crime and COVID-19, what would you do?
Oh, wow. We're so rarely given that kind of money as criminologists.
I'm the dean, but
it's
I don't
even
have that
hard
much
for
money,
me to.
But just say we said we want to commission a $10 million study to really measure the most important things that we need to know.
I mean, given my recent research on criminal justice reform in California, you know, California has been for the last 10 years or so involved in a massive prison reduction. Its population has plummeted in terms of the number of people that we incarcerate and for how long as a result of some major reforms that our state has undertaken, with very little consequence for crime, I should say. So AB 109 realignment, Prop 47, the research has shown, mine included, that you can downsize the prisons, removing individuals that have committed very low-level offenses, return them back to the communities without much of a consequence for crime. Now we're seeing in states, our state's prison population, but especially in our jail population, massive reductions of people incarcerated, primarily because we're concerned about COVID. So jails across the United States are releasing individuals, people who pose very low risk to society. And they're also taking folks out of prison at a much slower rate and releasing them because of concerns about the spread of the virus and COVID more generally. What impact will this sort of thing have? These criminal justice changes that sort of coincide with these reforms have on crime throughout the United States. We're at a moment where we've recognized in this country that we can't incarcerate at the levels that we've been doing that. And there's proposals by some to reduce our prison populations carefully, of course. And what are the consequences of that? And so one set of questions I would be interested in is looking at these criminal justice changes, in part reforms, in part responses to COVID, and seeing kind of what impact they're having, not just on crime, but society more generally. And it's not just our jails and our prisons. Courts are also, prosecutors are not necessarily prosecuting low-level offenses at the moment. And police are also changing their behavior. They're issuing citations rather than making arrests, again, for low-level offenses. And so this allows us to ask the question, could we be doing things differently in terms of how we're handling the processing of crimes and offenders without having much of an impact on crime? I don't know. But that's a question I'm personally interested in light of the past research I've done on criminal justice reform.
Well, and that would be such an interesting example because you have actual legislation that reduces, incarceration rates, but then you also have a crisis,
right,
a health crisis. So you have sort of two different kind of reasons for it, but you can still study the outcome. So I think it's important to point out from what we've learned from you today that we've seen a reduction in incarceration, and you had mentioned that jail populations have gone down by 30%, and we've also seen a decrease in crime.
Right.
So the common thinking that if we let people out of jails or prisons, crime's going to go up is actually not happening.
Right. I mean, at this point, it's anecdotal, and we need studies
Right.
to establish this. But as I said while we were talking there, that 30%. The average jail across the United States has released 30% of people residing there, and prisons about 5%. So we have many individuals released. The question is, what impact will that have on crime? At this point, it doesn't seem to be having an impact on crime, but we need studies to link the two in a more definitive way. At the end, it raises the question, how might this pandemic help us to think about doing things differently? And can we make changes to our criminal justice system, whether we're talking about police, courts, or corrections, that end up doing less harm while not making changes to public safety, not causing crime to go up? And I think that's an important question we should be asking, and this pandemic gives us the opportunity to ask that question and determine the answer.
Well, and that's wonderful. We really are seeing silver linings. The environment is less polluted. We're being more humane in how we treat prisoners. There's so many ways that we can learn lessons from this. So this would be a great opportunity to have a natural experiment. We need to capture it, though, so we need to get research funding so that we can follow up the people and
I
the
should
places.
note, many of my colleagues who study jails and jail populations and prison populations are concerned that we're not doing enough because the spread of the virus is happening in jails and prisons, and it's affecting corrections officers and other prison administrative staff. So, there's a lot of opportunities here to figure out what we can be doing differently.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really a pleasure learning from you, and I know we'll learn a lot more in the webinar with the Q&A, and we invite everybody to join us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I hope to get some good questions in the Q&A webinar.